I'm going to be hosting this particular event. I'm the head of events and podcasts at Cllr. So I'll be asking some of the questions, and then when we get onto the Q&A section, I'll be making sure that everyone gets to ask their question to the particular panelist that they want to. So now that everyone's here, welcome, Bill. I think we shall get started, as it's just about time. So welcome, as I just said, again to today's event, everyone, where we will be discussing nuclear power and whether it is an energy dream or a nuclear nightmare. It's a bit like that episode of The West Wing, but without as much dramatic music or action sequences. We will be discussing whether it has a role in fighting climate change and how we should treat the energy source in the future. We'll also include, as I just mentioned, a question and answer section in the second half, where you have the chance to put your questions to the panel. If you do have any questions, make sure to put them in the chat either now or as the event goes on, and you can either ask the question yourself at the end if you raise your hand, either virtually or literally, though if you've not got your camera on, I won't be able to see that, so it's better to do it virtually. So the great panel that we have today, we are joined by Bill Esterson, the Labour MP for Sefton Central and Shadow Minister for International Trade. He was also previously the Shadow Minister for Small Business and Shadow Minister for International Trade previously. Also joined by Adrian Ramsay, who is the co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. He has also previously served as Deputy Leader of the Green Party and as a Norwich City Councillor, but please no questions about the pedestrianisation of Norwich City Centre. Last, but by no means least, we are joined by Penelope Hope, the co-founder of Rebel Energy UK, a supplier of renewable energy to customers in the UK. She was recently, back in 2021, awarded Utilities Businesswoman of the Year and is now the new head of the Centre think tank's Business Network. Thank you again for all the panel for joining us and to everyone who is participating. My first question is this, and it's for Bill. Do you think it's possible to reach net zero without nuclear power?
Thanks very much, Will. Lovely to see everybody, and thanks for joining us. Well, I suppose the technical question is, if you've got unlimited time, then yes, you can do it without nuclear power, but it's a question of how quickly we need to move, and this is why we accept the recommendations broadly of the Committee on Climate Change, that nuclear has a very important part to play in reaching net zero in energy generation. And our target, where we're starting now, would be 2030 in renewables, which is doubling of onshore wind, trebling of solar, and quadrupling of offshore wind, in which nuclear has a base load role to play, while we invest in tidal, while we invest in bioenergy with carbon capture and storage as alternatives to base load. But yes, right now nuclear is going to play a part, and we accept the analysis that nuclear will play its part, and we have to address the challenges around safety as well. But look, we've clearly got to do something about this for climate considerations. We've also got to do it for energy security and price considerations. And the other element of our plan actually is to invest in insulation and reducing bills, and it is very, very frustrating for everybody, whether you're a homeowner paying higher bills or part of the building trade who want to make the most of the opportunity, that we no longer deliver 2 million homes with better insulation, as we did as recently as 2013, before David Cameron decided to get rid of what he called the green crap. I asked him about the green crap at a Prime Minister's question about that time. And so it is a combination of reducing usage and cutting bills, which you can do right now, but the longer term, really speeding up the investment in renewables. But unless you have nuclear as part of the mix, you're not going to get all the way there by our target of 2034 being self-sufficient in renewable generation, let alone by hitting net zero. And the government wants to go much further with nuclear. We think that is a mistake, and it is a very, very challenging way of doing things. And I'm afraid it points to them being much less ambitious in the use of renewables and over a period to 2050, which is where what their target is, much greater emissions in the meantime. So that's our plan, 2030. The publicly owned Great British Energy company to drive investment into renewables alongside, but with nuclear providing part of the base load.
Absolutely. Penelope, the same question to you. Do you think it's possible to reach net zero without nuclear power?
Absolutely, I think it's possible, Will. I think it's eminently possible. And we are actually already on our way to doing that. So if I can share some information from the energy sector, we had a development last year, which was made possible by a new project initiated by the National Grid, which is a change to the grid code. Now, the National Grid determines and maintains the grid codes. And this change means that for the first time, renewable generators will be offering the same kind of stability services, which have only traditionally been delivered by conventional generators, that's coal, oil and gas. Now, I'm going to share a quote from a senior spokesperson from the National Grid talking about the ramifications of this change. He says, "This is a breakthrough moment, a key piece in the energy transition jigsaw that will ensure we can operate a fully decarbonised grid and deliver on our net zero commitments." And he goes on to say, "It also ensures that as we transition away from conventional fossil fuel generation, we can operate the grid securely and efficiently, which will ultimately save consumers money." So if the National Grid is telling us that it's possible, and that train has already left the station, my question would be, who or what is feeding misinformation into the system, into our public psyche, to have us think anything otherwise? And I think there's two things feeding that, and I'd be delighted to hear from Bill and Adrian in respect of what they're seeing. I think the first thing feeding that is media, which is a for-profit driven information system. And I think the second thing is what I might call crony capitalism, where we have some MPs, and it's typically the hard right, in the pockets of the big corporations who are pushing their business interests to a position of state interests by developing relationships through lobbying and other practices. And so, Will, yes, it's possible. And let's make sure that we keep consciousness clear about the facts around what we can truly deliver.
Absolutely. Now, nuclear waste is often a divisive issue. Some have concerns that a leak from a nuclear waste storage facility will damage human health and the environment. Others see the storage of nuclear waste as something that can be dealt with using modern technology. Should we really be that worried about storing nuclear waste? Adrian, if you could respond to that first.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Yes, I think there are still real worries about nuclear waste, and I don't believe in scaremongering type stories, but really about just understanding what the risks are and whether the risks are worth it, given the alleged upsides. So I think it's possible to have a calm discussion about it. If we look at the types of waste, then the waste issue particularly is relevant in relation to high-level waste, which is where the majority of the radioactivity is. Whilst that radioactivity decreases over time through decay, it takes 1 million years for that process to happen before the level of radioactivity is down to the level it was at before the nuclear process. That's a huge amount of time in which to be able to have the confidence that we can safely store the waste, especially given that we know there will be dramatic changes to our society and to our climate in much shorter timescales than 1 million years there will be in the coming decades. So it really is a big risk to be putting in place for future generations going many times into the future, to be assuming that that's an effective thing to do. Exposure to the high level waste can have drastic effects on life, on human life, and on other species, on biodiversity, in terms of cancerous growths, in terms of genetic problems, for example. So it is a real issue, and there are examples of where there have been accidents and where there's been human error. And I'm not going to suggest that happens all the time, but they're frequently enough. There's certainly been a few well-documented ones in the last decade that they're frequent enough, and that the level of risk associated with it, the impact that the risk would have if it happened, is big enough that I think we've got to take it very seriously. We haven't got a permanent storage solution, especially if we continue to see significant increases in the amount of nuclear energy being produced. And if you look at the UK situation in particular, the government has tried 6 times in the last 42 years to find a location where there's local support for actually storing nuclear waste and dealing with it. Its most recent attempt has been a new approach of voluntarism and partnership, which has failed to secure support from the community, for example, in the Sellafield area where it's most recently been looking. And multiple official bodies have warned that the Sellafield site poses a significant risk to people and the environment. Having accumulated an extraordinary accumulation of hazardous waste, much of it is stored in outdated nuclear facilities. So I think there are significant concerns about waste which we don't have an answer to, and which would pose real threats and growing threats, I think, for decades to come, and many generations to come.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Bill, turning to you, I mean, what are your thoughts on this issue? There were obviously real concerns about the storing of nuclear waste. Do you think it's something that we should be worried about and maybe put off further investment on nuclear, or do you think that we do have a way forward in terms of storing it?
Well, we should always worry about these things, Will, because nuclear waste is very dangerous. But we have 60 years of experience in this country, arguably the best in the world at decommissioning and dealing with nuclear waste, precisely because we were so early into it. And if anybody hasn't been to visit Sellafield, it is a very interesting visit, and it tells the story of just how dangerous and how difficult it is to deal with waste from the history of the nuclear generation industry in this country. But if we come to the present day, we are in a very different place, because the most modern technology has found a much better way of delivering safe nuclear energy. The design is much stronger, the protections are much stronger. Lessons have been learned from some very serious accidents like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island over the years, and the protections are in place to deal with terrorism or the consequences of the climate emergency, actually. Which brings me to the point about what we do with the waste. We've got to deal with the waste already that's been generated, and actually the new technologies produce much less waste than previous versions of nuclear reactors, for a start. But where Adrian is right is that there hasn't been an agreement yet on a geological storage facility, and that's clearly something that's going to have to be sorted out. But that's going to have to be sorted out whether we use our existing nuclear facilities, whether we build new ones in addition, or whether we stop right now because we've got this historical volume of waste. So at some stage we're going to have to find a way of dealing with it, and whether we add to that or not, that problem will exist. So I'll come back to the first question: do we want to use nuclear or not? If we don't use it, we are accepting greater use of oil or gas, predominantly gas, potentially coal, and we know, I mean, Adrian made the point about vested interests. I think it was Adrian who made the point. Look, there are people who want fracking to happen in this country because they will make money out of it. There are people who want more oil and gas fields to be given permission in the North Sea. That's something Keir Starmer has now ruled out from a Labour government. And if we are going to make the progress of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, of minimizing our carbon footprint from energy generation, nuclear has to play a part, and we have to solve the very many challenges, including what we do with the waste.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And of course, the spectre of nuclear accidents has already been brought up. Accidents like Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. And they've obviously impacted how the public and politicians see nuclear power. Do we believe that these disasters are a warning for those looking to use nuclear power, or simply the result of bad technology and, in some cases, human error in using that technology? Penelope, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Will, for the question. Well, I think if we look at those 3 instances that you've mentioned there, 2 of those are technological, and one of those is as a result of natural forces. So Fukushima, that was an earthquake out at sea, which triggered a tsunami, which hit the coast where the generator was located, and there was a nuclear accident. That tells me 2 things. It tells me that this highly sensitive radioactive material is vulnerable to externalities, the externalities of human error in operating the technology to make the nuclear possible. And it's vulnerable to elemental forces, tectonic activity, and the unknown unknowns. But there's a third externality, which isn't so often talked about, and that is offensive military action. Now, if we look at what's happening in the news at the moment, we have Russia trying to take a hold of a nuclear facility in eastern Ukraine. Now, let's just say a missile were to be fired in that direction, which would trigger a nuclear accident. Let's just hope we're not downwind of that, should that occur. Because we know from the Chernobyl disaster that you have the blast impact, you have the thermal flash, and you have the ionizing radiation. And that goes up into the atmosphere and it's carried on the weather systems. And Chernobyl radiation ended up raining down in Wales, which hit the grass, and the livestock, sheep, eat the grass, and sheep are slaughtered to be delivered up as food for humans. They enter the food chain. So in that disaster, the government had to order for all of the sheep in Wales to be killed, lest they should poison through ingestion us as humans. So we're intricately interlinked, and we have to be mindful of that. Mm-hmm. I think what we also need to think about is under what circumstances was nuclear technology conceived? And if we wind back through the decades, it was conceived as a weapon of war, and not just that, but a weapon of mass destruction for the annihilation of huge portions of the population. And I suppose my question would be, from a moral perspective, is that if that is the case, if that is the malintent under which this idea was conceived, can we ever truly hope for something good to come out of that?
Mm-hmm. The same question to you, Bill. Looking back at those 3 accidents, do you believe that they are warnings or simply bad technology? Do you think that ultimately the possibility of accidents like that happening in the future is going to reduce as technology gets better? What do you think?
Yeah, well, the technology that was around when Fukushima happened, and when 3 Mile Island happened, and when Chernobyl happened, was clearly vulnerable, and lessons have been learned. And Hinkley Point C, Sizewell, if it happens, are of completely different standards and wouldn't be vulnerable to any of the circumstances that caused those disasters. I think that's an important point to make. But look, we do have to ask ourselves the question: how are we going to replace the 10 gigawatts by 2035, which is what the Committee on Climate Change says is needed? It's consistent with what the Labour Party is proposing as part of our renewable energy plan. How do we do it without nuclear? And the alternative is just to Penelope's point, and yes, it was. I don't disagree with the analysis about why we have a nuclear industry, because it was the byproduct of the creation of atomic bombs at the end of the Second World War. That is correct. And yes, you're quite right that the Chernobyl disaster caused an environmental disaster in Wales. But these things have been addressed in the technology, in the advances in technology. The alternative, though, is we rely on gas, or potentially oil as well, potentially even coal, and continue to add to global warming through our emissions, through our CO2 emissions. And these are the questions that we have to address. And it's why the conclusion I reach, which is the Labour conclusion, is that nuclear has its place in addressing the very, very serious challenge of how we decarbonise as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, talking about technology and developments in technology, nuclear fusion is obviously one part of that. Adrian, do you think that nuclear fusion is the future of nuclear energy, or do you think that this technology is unlikely to be practical?
Well, the whole question we're debating here is around what technologies are going to be available in the timescales and the scale that are needed to address the climate emergency. I think we can all agree that that's the basis on which we're talking about this topic. And in terms of nuclear fusion, we've been promised since the 1950s that it's 30 years off. Mm-hmm. And despite recent pronouncements, there's no evidence that we're any closer than that now. And yet the climate emergency needs to be tackled in a far quicker time frame than that. And any form of nuclear has long lead-in times, has a huge price tag attached to it. And if we were putting that money directly into a massive expansion of renewables, both big scale renewables and domestic and building scale renewables, into measures to reduce energy use, which is far too often left out of this debate, but home insulation measures, measures to make the economy more localized and effective by reducing energy use that way, we have a far bigger effect with the same amount of money. It's estimated from academics that nuclear fusion could be 10 times as expensive as conventional nuclear, and even conventional nuclear, the new nuclear, there's every reason to think that it has far less of an impact, and certainly a far slower impact than if you put that money directly into renewables and into energy efficiency. So there are real arguments around what's physically possible in the time available, around what's financially viable, and whether renewables would end up being squeezed. And if you look at what the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor Project has said, even their head of communications acknowledges that the technology is questionable as a contribution to carbon targets in 2050, let alone the earlier timescales, which I think lots of us on this call have already referred to. So for me, there's lots of people who've had long-standing ideological concerns about nuclear. I think it's a very practical question we've got now, whether it's on big-scale nuclear or on nuclear fusion, is can these technologies deliver in the timescales we need them to? Are they good value for money? And in my view, new nuclear is not where the money should be focused. The focus should be on mass scaling up of renewables and energy efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Bill, the same question to you. Do you think that nuclear fusion can be the future of nuclear energy, or do you think that it is ultimately, as Adrian said there, something that keeps being promised is going to happen in the next 30 years but doesn't ever actually materialise?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think any of us do. It is. We heard some exciting news a few weeks ago or months ago now, didn't we? About a recent successful test, but we're a very long way off. And I think the point is well made about investment at one level. But look, we're going to have to invest in a lot of technologies. It may well be that nuclear fusion is one of them. just to the point about cost of fission, though, I mean, France has a very large nuclear program and has very much lower energy prices right now than the UK, in part because of public ownership, I would suggest, and Labour's plans to create the Great British Energy Company will undoubtedly help there. But they have demonstrated the scalability of it in France. I think it has to be part of the plan. I was just looking at the cost of nuclear compared to other forms of energy. Well, sorry, I was just looking at the CO2 emissions rather than the cost, which is also very important. It's the same emissions as wind, because even renewable energy does produce emissions, because we're talking about net zero, not about absolute zero, because there's greenhouse gases produced in the manufacturing processes and in the decommissioning processes, whether we like it or not. Solar produces 4 times as much CO2 as nuclear, and hydrogen twice as much. Hydroelectric twice as much. Of course, fossil fuels are far higher than that. So I think it's important to put in perspective all of these options. And the Committee on Climate Change talks about a balanced pathway. And I, as somebody who hopes to be, I'm Shadow Business and Industry Minister, so I have a BEIS shadow role. Hopefully, I will have a ministerial role. I'm looking at what is the best way. Well, this isn't directly my briefs, Alan Whitehead's, but I'll certainly have a role in it because I cover net zero. What is the best way of delivering on the net zero agenda? What is the best way of delivering cheaper energy? We've got a massive problem across industry as well as for consumers, where our electricity prices are 60% higher than in Germany. We've got to address all of these challenges, and we've got to address them as fast as possible. So it is, this point about investment, it is looking at all of the options. We haven't talked about hydrogen yet. Hydrogen is part of this. Again, an unproven technology like tidal is, although I think I will probably acknowledge that both hydrogen and tidal are more proven than fusion right now. But we've got to consider the options. We've got to support investment in a range of options, carbon capture and storage as well, if we are going to make the kind of progress that we need in the timescales that we need.
Mm-hmm. Unlike most forms of renewables, nuclear power is not an intermittent source of power. Will we always need some form of energy that runs without interruption, unlike wind or solar? Penelope, what do you think?
I think it's safe to say that we need a massive investment in the improvement and advancement of battery technology. And I think we need to set that as a national priority, particularly if we want to bring a massive amount of new energy onto the grid. I think the phrase intermittent is a little bit misleading, and I would probably delineate between irregular and regular forms of renewable energy. So irregular forms of renewable energy would be wind and wave. And let's remember that those two are linked, of course, because longshore coastal winds drives the coastal currents. It's unpredictable. Regular forms of renewable generation include solar and tidal. And remember, those photovoltaic cells don't need sunlight to operate, they just need daylight. So with solar, we have a guaranteed supply every single day in a predictable rhythm. And with tidal, we have a guaranteed 4 times a day supply, because we have an in and out tide and another in and out tide every single day on a 24-hour rotation. So we can guarantee that these sources will generate for us. So we have to think then about this missed opportunity with tidal. We've got more than 3,000 miles of coastline, and it's craggy coastline, which means we have a lot of inlets. We've got the Thames Estuary, we've got the Humber, we've got the Bristol Channel, we've got the Forth River at Edinburgh. And anywhere you've got an inlet, you've got a massive amount of tidal power coming in and out on these regularized motions. Now, a tidal generator is very straightforward. It's an industrial sized rotor with an anchor attached, and you sink it to the bottom of the seabed and you put a cage on top so that it doesn't interfere with any wildlife. Then you connect that energy to a local substation, which is floating, and the substation connects the energy straight back onto land. This is a huge opportunity for us. Even if we deployed 5% of our coastline to tidal initiatives, we'd have a big boost to our renewable generation economy. Then we've got to think about those inlets. So you may have heard of a tidal lagoon, for instance. A tidal lagoon is a systemized series of tidal rotors which are combined together, and they can be deployed across inlets or bays. We saw under David Cameron's government a tidal lagoon commissioned in Swansea Bay, which would have provided continuous renewable energy for 600,000 local residents. That was scrapped under Boris Johnson's administration. So it seems to me that we need battery storage and innovation. We need a massive investment in tidal, and we need continuity of government thinking and program delivery to make sure that the projects we commission get through to delivery, whether that's under a Labour government or a Conservative government. We need some kind of continuity of thinking. When I look at what's come out in the news lately about levelling up initiatives, and I'm not here to debate the strategic merit of levelling up as an overarching theme, but I think of the New Eden project, which has been suggested, I think, for Morecambe Bay. Now, that essentially is a fancy building and a tourist attraction. And to my mind, that can only bring so much economic generation to a dilapidated coastal town. Renewable generation, however, could provide a really exciting solution, because to commission a tidal lagoon, for instance, we need to move jobs into those areas to survey it, commission it, implement it, build it, operate it, maintain it. And when you move jobs and expertise into local communities, that puts their consumer spending power to work, and you start to generate the local economies. And once they've finished on one renewable generation project, I'd be surprised if they didn't initiate on others. So there's an opportunity here to put our foot down on renewable generation as a way to repair our economy and as a socially accretive solution to some of the issues that we're facing at the moment.
Adrian, the same question. Do you think we will always need some form of energy that runs without interruption, like wind or solar?
Yeah, this is a commonly asked question, isn't it, in terms of the grid? And it's important to bear in mind that we're not asking this question in terms of where we are right now today, because I'm not proposing that we cease using the existing nuclear power stations. For me, the question is whether we build new ones and whether that's the right route and the right investment. And actually, in terms of the future direction of the grid and how to make things work, there's a growing body of evidence and growing number of stakeholders in the sector who argue that actually the idea of focusing on a large-scale centralized power supplying base load is actually quite outdated compared to where we need to be going in the future, and that actually we need to have a far greater focus on things like battery storage, as Penelope says, on flexibility, and on systems that encourage decentralization and support for renewable infrastructure. Now, you may say, are those things actually at odds with each other? But as I say, there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that they could be. So, for example, back in 2015, the then CEO of National Grid, Steve Holliday, spelled out the issues around this and said that the idea of large power stations for baseload is outdated, and that's from someone who was at the National Grid at the time. And we've seen similar arguments made by others. For example, the National Infrastructure Commission has made similar arguments that it's more costly and less flexible to put all of your eggs in the basket of big nuclear rather than allowing greater flexibility. And even the International Energy Agency has said that power system flexibility has got to be the priority if we're to have a more decentralized grid in the future. And that's been backed up as well by a study by academics at University of Sussex, who published a paper in Nature Energy last year, where they said that in practice, if you focus on new nuclear, it does tend to crowd out renewables. And it does tend to mean that the focus ends up being on large-scale centralised production rather than small-scale decentralised. So to get the flexibility, we need to get the focus on investment in renewables to maximise the impact of battery storage. And in fact, we've seen estimates that we could have 25 million electric vehicles by 2035, which is just an example of how you could use the overall electricity grid very effectively for storage. You know, there's many options that we can be pursuing that I think are much more cost effective than nuclear, but also which use our open up the options for genuinely supporting renewables far more effectively.
Mm-hmm. So we've come to the end of my set questions. We're now in the Q&A section of this event. So have a look at the chat. I think there are some questions there that have come in. We've got a question from Tim Rickman for Bill. Tim, would you like to ask the question, or would you like me to ask it for you? No, I'm happy to ask it for you. So Tim's question... Oh, the message. Oh, he says that his no microphone. Okay, so his question for you, Bill, is this: enough nuclear generation capacity will be needed to provide peak grid demand for when there is no wind or solar generation. Thus, whenever wind or solar also provide electricity, there will be a surplus. So what is the point of having any wind or solar generation? Turning down a nuclear plant saves virtually no money or resources. But Bill, what's your response to that?
Well, I'm not sure I entirely understood the question, but we clearly need some. I mean, I think to Adrian, the point Adrian just made, actually, we've got a roughly 10 gigawatts of nuclear generation at the moment, and our plan actually is to ensure by 2035 that is where we're at, rather than going beyond it. This government's plan is to go for 24 gigawatts by 2050. And then which I think makes, I mean, Adrian's point about really putting all your eggs in one basket probably fits with current government policy and base planning. And we don't think that's a good idea for a variety of reasons, including financial ones. When wind is so much cheaper now than pretty much anything else, when solar is becoming cheaper, then it makes sense to invest there. But there is this gap where we don't have the technology, we don't have the capacity to store the excess generation. And again, the evidence base at the moment suggests we're not going to be in that position for some time to come. That's why nuclear has a role to play for a period of time. And it's why you have this mixed economy. I did want to pick up something Penelope said. Now, far be it from me to miss an opportunity to have a go at Boris Johnson, but I mean, it was an appalling smear of Boris Johnson to accuse him of it being his government that cancelled Swansea Bay, because it was actually Theresa May's. Now, the only reason I know that is because I responded to the statement from Cllr, the then business secretary, when they announced the cancellation. And the next item of business was the expansion of Heathrow Airport and building the 5th runway. And Boris Johnson was notoriously absent as Foreign Secretary, so he didn't have to vote on it, having promised to lie down in front of the bulldozers. So it's funny how you remember certain things, but very happy to join criticism of him otherwise, including on the various parts of this topic. I mean, look, we've got to address all of these points. We've got to dramatically expand our battery capacity. You know, the very, very worrying news that British Volt went into administration the other week shows how far we've got to come. I mean, Germany are going to have 10 gigafactories. We so far aren't off the blocks. I mean, our plan is to have 8, is to have charging points across the country, to have grants and loans, grants for low-income families, loans for everybody else, low-interest loans for everybody else, so we can get we can transition to an electric fleet of vehicles. All of these things come together. All of these things put huge demand. I mean, that point you made, Penelope, about the opportunity for regional growth or leveling up, whichever you want to style it. Yeah, absolutely. The renewable industry is part of it, as is retrofitting and installing insulation. Creates lots of jobs, as well as cutting bills and revitalizing communities. There is so many aspects of this agenda that are really attractive, but it is looking at it as a whole. And I think the long term is about having an industrial strategy. So we've published an industrial strategy of which our energy plans are part. And in the end, we're going to need to get agreement from that lasts way beyond single parliaments, that goes way across parties, that takes the British people with us, that we can deliver an agenda that's going to be effective for our energy security and playing our part in addressing the climate emergency.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Does anybody have another question for the panel? There's not anything in the chat at the moment, but someone... Oh, Mark's raised his hand. Hopefully the mic should activate in a moment, Mark. Oh, there we go.
Hi, thank you. So, so Mark, just I'm a Green Party member. So I was particularly interested with the Adrian's particular issue with new nuclear as opposed to previous nuclear, because Green Party policy is to phase out current nuclear. So it'd be interesting to see if any motions come to that, whether Adrian will support the idea that we can keep our current nuclear capacity. What I do want to say is that quotes from the grid that Penelope quoted earlier, using fossil fuels, the lumping in of nuclear into fossil fuels, I think was a bit misleading. It's true that we can run a grid without fossil fuels. Absolutely. I don't think anyone here is going to argue with that. IPCC says nuclear. So it's a little bit difficult when we start quoting experts, when one of the biggest pieces of work done in terms of reaching net zero was done by IPCC, which specifically said nuclear. What I do want to say is when it comes down to costs, there's a recent publication that was commissioned by 100% Renewable UK, which I thought was very interesting. It looked at costs, it was widely shared. What it did do is it specifically said it excluded interannual storage costs. And it estimated that these would be roughly in the ballpark of 30 billion per year, which is quite substantial. And when we look at costs of renewables, I think the storage costs need to be particularly understood, because that's where the costs come in. And then on beyond that, I think we also have to look at the real world examples of France, that's already been mentioned as a good example, but also Germany. And look what Germany have done by closing nuclear now, and look at what their CO2 emissions is. So my question, I do have one, is that to go back to both Penelope and Adrian and say where we've got real world example of scaled nuclear that has shown that we can deliver low carbon in conjunction with renewables, do we really support our current position, which is that we are going to be reliant on future technology to reach 100% renewables, and currently are satisfied with the phasing out of nuclear and then the combinations of renewable and gas, which is the Green Party policy based on its current model, to balance the load?
Thank you very much for your question, Mark. So who would like to go first, Adrian or Penelope?
I don't mind. Yeah, I'll start. Penelope, you come in. Well, I think it's a good point about whether we rely on future technologies, because that is a big concern of mine in relation to the whole debate. And indeed, it's one of the arguments that I've raised in relation to new nuclear, is the lead-in time from a nuclear power station being commissioned to producing any energy, which was going to be at least 10 years. And there have been some studies that have suggested it could be significantly more than that. I've been involved in the campaign against Sizewell, which is near to me in Suffolk, where it's just been given the green light, but there's no work started yet, and there's certainly time to change course on that, given the huge public cost that there would be, as well directly as well as the indirect cost in terms of levies on bills. And so I think that money could go much better into renewables and energy efficiency. And there are other technologies as well, where we're reliant on whether they come to fruition. Some of the more high-tech carbon capture and storage, there's limited evidence about its impact and effectiveness. Same as some of the other sort of geoengineering type solutions. Whereas if we really focus on the solutions that are available and scaling those up with the significant investment they need in terms of renewables and in terms of energy efficiency, then that's where it could have the biggest impact most quickly. And I think it's a bit of a false comparison to say that a model without new nuclear relies on gas in the short term and one with new nuclear doesn't, because, as I say, new nuclear will take 10, maybe 17 years to come to fruition. So that's just a false argument, because renewables will be, if they have the investment, will be generating that additional energy much more quickly. And in terms of return on investment, it's worth just remembering the figures around Hinkley Point C, which I know you mentioned in the chat, Mark. When it was first mooted in 2008, the cost was supposed to be 4 billion, and yet by 2019 that had risen to 23 billion, and it's still rising. So the costs just spiral, and it was the same fears around Sizewell. And with Sizewell, there is plenty of time to still change direction.
Penelope, would you like to respond to Mark's question?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the question, Mark. And I think I would support some of Adrian's comments there about the lead-in time. Now, that's really significant because we have a climate emergency. And I think we have to ask ourselves if we can afford to wait for new nuclear power coming online in 10 or 15 years' time, given the life cycle cost. So not just the cost to commission, but the cost to operate and the cost to decommission, in light of the fact that renewable energy generation assets are significantly cheaper to install and maintain. When I look at I think perhaps what Mark may have been referring to when he's talking about use cases where a lot of nuclear has been rolled out, well, France is one of them. But a lot of the nuclear power stations in France are sitting fallow because the government can't afford to renew them. It's an incredibly expensive source of power. So the other big issue that has come up is this idea about demand. We need nuclear to satisfy these big peaks in demand. And I think to answer that question, we have to look at the mechanics of the grid. So the grid was built to transport energy. That's what it's for, which means that if there's an energy dip in one form of the country, energy can be transported from another area. Now, one of the things that we're missing to update our grid is investment in the hardware of the network. Literally, the nuts and the bolts and the wires of our network are deteriorating, and we have a capacity issue. Energy generation falls into three marked categories. You've got 33 kilovolts and above, which is your big energy generation power plants. And we are at capacity for that level. So unless there's massive investment into updating our network infrastructure, we can't bring a lot more online. But there's an opportunity at the mid-tier level, that's localized renewable energy generation between 11 kilovolts and 33 kilovolts. Now, that's really the sweet spot, because when you're generating it in that category, you don't have to connect your energy into the national grid. So you circumvent the capacity issue. In that bracket, the energy instead goes directly into a local substation, which means that we can get that demand, which is the issue that has been mentioned, without the need for nuclear power. And to reiterate the point I made about battery storage, this is the thing both at a national and a localized community level is really going to enable us to wean ourselves off bridging fuels like nuclear and get onto totally green sources of energy.
I think there is a comment that Mark, this is a separate Mark from who asked the question a few minutes ago, as for Penelope relating to France. I don't know, can you see that point, Penelope? Would you like to respond to it?
I'll just read it out for the group. So France still has amongst the lowest retail prices for electricity in the EU and has for a long time, which is true. Germany, the poster child of the 100 renewables revolution, has amongst the highest. Thank you so much for that, Mark. What we've seen over the last 20 years is a massive decrease in the price of renewable energy. So we're starting to come to the base of that bell curve. And that is because as any new form of technology is ramping up being rolled out, it takes a while for those cost efficiencies to start coming through. So we need to give it time. A big issue that we have, as I said, is infrastructure and network ability. And that's not just at a national level, but that's also at a microgrid level. So when we have our own solar panels and our own generation asset equipments at the level of our individual home, that's going to make things much cheaper because there's less distance for the energy to cross. And that also solves the latency issue, which we have when those electrons are traveling for long distances. So I do think it's possible to have a cheap, affordable, socially inclusive form of renewable energy supply at a national level.
So obviously we're coming towards the end of this particular event, and one question that I think I have for everyone on the panel is this: in terms of, we've discussed the public's perception of nuclear energy, but in terms of how nuclear energy is portrayed in drama, one of the most chilling recent examples being the Chernobyl miniseries. To what extent do we think that that has influenced the public's perception of nuclear and perhaps changed the debate in ways where if those dramas didn't exist and people didn't watch them, they perhaps might not have the same views on nuclear energy? I don't know whoever would like to go first in response to that. Adrian, would you like to respond?
I didn't jump in because I wasn't sure what my contribution was going to be. I may not have been watching the same films and programs as you will in order to offer an informed comment. I mean, the arts have an important role to play in helping us think about what positive futures can be like. And there is a bit of a tendency, isn't there, in films and programs to portray dystopias of different sorts in relation to the climate emergency more generally, even if I've not seen it so much in relation to nuclear. Whether they're, I'm thinking there particularly of non-fiction, but it could also apply to the way fiction is. Sorry, I'm thinking of fiction, but it could also apply to the way non-fiction is described. So I suppose my main thought on this would be, what's the potential for the arts to demonstrate a positive future where we've addressed these issues and we're living in a much healthier, happier, net zero future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, Bill, do you have any response to that in terms of the way that drama shapes our perception of particular issues like nuclear?
Well, whether it's dramas or media reporting, one of the things I've discovered in previous careers where I've known a subject and has been confirmed many times over as a politician is that sometimes the reporting of these things is not accurate. So why should it be any different with the reporting of what happens with nuclear power? I guess is the simple answer. But look, you know my views. I've expressed that we need nuclear power as part of the mix, and we're going to have to the public with us. No one ever wants these things in their backyard unless it's already there. Although the public in Hinckley seem to be relatively happy with it because there's already been generations of nuclear power stations there. But in the end, we're going to need to take people with us, and whatever doom and gloom is expressed in documentaries or elsewhere in the media, we've got to deal with it.
Well, I think I'm going to wrap there, as I know that Adrian has to get off, and I don't want to detain the rest of you any much longer than I have to. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this event. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for the panel for taking the time to answer my questions and the audience's questions. Our next event will be in March. It will be on devolution and will include Neil Kinnock. He will be amongst the panel, amongst others. So I hope you sign up for that event and come along to it if you've enjoyed this one. So thank you once again to everyone for coming to the event. I hope you come to the next event in March. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks very much,
Thanks, Will. Thanks.